Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for coming in this pre-holiday crazy period where everyone's running around trying to do 8 million things in a short, compressed time frame. So we appreciate your attendance today. My name is Neil Aronson, partner at Gennari Aronson, and I wanted to talk briefly about our panelists today. We could probably spend the full hour talking about all of their accomplishments, and we're thrilled that they could all join us today. I'm going to just work my way down, give a brief introduction to each person. They can, down the road, add some items as well. Immediately to my right is Matt Molberger from Pearl-Meyer, and Matt's a vice president with Pearl-Meyer, where he works in the technology and life sciences sectors, and is really experienced in all aspects of executive compensation, including benchmarking, short and long-term incentive plans, and plan design, and other areas. Next to him is Jim Poe from Radius Partners. Jim has been in the executive search area for quite some time. Somebody told me the other day, I said, I've been doing this for 30 years. They said, don't do that, it makes you sound old. Jim's not quite there yet, but in terms of 30 years, but he's consulted with over 300 businesses in retained searches, helping them to identify, attract, and recruit senior executive talent. Next to Jim is Linda Rossetti. Linda is currently focusing on women's development through research, writing, and advocacy. She's just written a fabulous book. It's a quick read and very interesting and entertaining, called Women in Transition, Reinventing Work and Life. And that was published by Palgrave Macmillan, just last month. Linda serves as the managing director of Golden Seeds, which is an angel capital network dedicated to providing growth capital to women-led businesses. Prior to that, Linda's been in several very interesting positions dealing with human resources. She was executive vice president for human resources for a small company called Iron Mountain, and took it through a period where it went from its traditional paper in the warehouse business to high technology data storage. Prior to that was at Perot Systems and had her own startup called eMaven. Let's see, what did I do next? Angelo Santinelli is a professor of entrepreneurship here at Babson, and is involved in many different technology startups. He previously worked at Northbridge Venture Capital and has worked at several large companies, and we're thrilled to have Angelo. And finally, Larry Nannis, who I've known for quite some time. Larry is one of the founding partners of Katz, Nannis, and Solomon, an accounting firm based in Waltham, which does a lot of work representing small and emerging businesses. Larry, in fact, was the head of SBAIN, the Small Business Association of New England, for many years, and we're thrilled to have Larry join us. So that's our panel for today. So I wanted to start by talking about not just compensating people, but finding people, because these days I hear more and more clients saying, I really need to get this C-level executive, or I need a senior design engineer, and I just can't find anyone. And Jim, what's the market like today? What are you seeing?
We're seeing the market has become, over the last couple of years, much more solid and very competitive. And in general, I'm always a little hesitant to answer questions about the new market, because we do work at the senior executive level, and those are oftentimes kind of not always discretionary hires. It's not like we're recruiting developers or accountants or what have you. But overall, the activity level, I guess, is the way I would approach it, has been very consistent and quite good and competitive. We're finding that executives we're dealing with, when we get down to the selection stage, are oftentimes, even if we started out and we were the only opportunity they were considering, by the time the process gets to the final selection stage, they have 2 or 3 or 4 other things that they're looking at. So, pretty competitive.
So for Linda and Angelo, if you're working with an earlier stage company that's competing against a huge corporation to attract talent, what are some of the tools you use for identifying and then bringing these people on board?
Sure. Well, the first thing I'll say is many times, at least in the early stage, this is no news to anyone in the room, the companies can't afford the fine services of some of the retained search firms, right? So it's really a guerrilla approach, right? It is leveraging everyone's network and everyone who is involved, and to identify the potential candidates who could fill a role, it is talking with everyone involved, from the terrific people who are providing legal services to the friends and family who know about the firm, and really trying to leverage those networks. And it's amazing what those networks can produce when you're very clear about what it is you need. And so that's the only other thing I'll say, is that oftentimes people are very quick to say, oh, I need a fill in the blank. And they shortchange the time on really interrogating what it is they need. And if there's anything that you can do to really up your likelihood of success, it is less about going and shaking hands and more about really spending the time to interrogate exactly what skills you need, and not what the fire drill is this minute, but in 6 months, what is that person or role going to need to do? And very often people are really focused on the next milestone, and the reality is a relationship, particularly with a key executive, is long-term. And they need to be able to do multiple things. So that's my start.
Well, no, I would absolutely agree with especially the last comment about having some visibility into the future and knowing what you're going to need. I think all too often, I work with a lot of new founders, and I don't think they realize how long it takes to interview and how long it takes to find the right person. And so it does often become a fire drill, and you pick the wrong person. Then you try and explain to them the cost of choosing the wrong individual, the opportunity of the lost time. They're not quite, the fit isn't there. In general, young founders hire too fast, fire too slow. So now you have somebody that's been there for 6 months, 9 months, not doing the quality of work that you need, and that becomes a big issue. And then I wanted just to go back to address, you said, when you're competing with the big companies, I think was part of your question. My general rule is, if somebody is attracted to a large company, then I tell the founders I don't want them in the startup. There was a point in time here in Boston, I know I personally did it when I left a 6-figure job, took a pay cut of almost 40 or 50% and went to work at a startup, and you did it for the stock options. And it seems in today's world, people want the options but don't value them the way they used to.
Right.
So they want to make these lateral moves and things like that, and you can't afford to do that as a startup. We've got to get back to people working for less money than they would if they were working at a big company, and putting the value on the stock.
It's interesting, I was at an event at TripAdvisor, which just has built this huge, beautiful building right next to our offices. I was there last week, and I was talking to someone who had just graduated from college and was there. He was looking around at the cycling classrooms and the yoga rooms and the cafeteria. So he goes, "Wow, can I live here?" And the large companies, providing a year's paid maternity or paternity leave, etc. They really are focusing in, to follow up on what you said, Angelo, on non-equity types of incentive compensation, and that seems to be very, very attractive to millennials. And I was looking. The Newton Chamber of Commerce tomorrow is having an event on innovations to attract and retain top talents, and they talk about childcare, extended paternity leave, mandatory paid vacation time. Mandatory is the most interesting word there. Elder care assistance, fitness, encouragement, job sharing, collaborative office design, etc. So to follow up, what we would call kind of soft benefits, but what are increasingly important.
Sounds like a university.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's right.
Can I go?
So following up on Linda's comment about being very specific about what you're looking for, and Angelo, what you said, people aren't often moving fast enough they're making the wrong hiring decisions, they're not moving quickly enough to let people go. How do you work the network? How do you most effectively reach out to people, Linda, from your perspective, in terms of getting the right person?
Well, I think you first have to start with a quick elevator pitch on what you need, right? Which really goes to exactly over a 2-year cycle, what is that role going to need to produce for the organization? and get a quick summary of that and get that out, you know. Call your board members, call the people you've actually tried to seek money from, even if they've said no. Say, hey, we know you were at least interested in what we were trying to do. Let us tell you we're trying to find this person. Is there anyone in your network, you know, who you might put forward? And really continually work that. And, you know, and by the way, when you go to your kid's school or your grandchild's school to go to something else, mention it. And mention it everywhere. And I just think it's tremendously surprising to me what comes back from that. I've always been surprised in the positive as to how productive that is.
Jim, from your perspective, as you're working on a retained search, how do you go out and find the right people?
Well, we always start off an assignment, you know, with basically two types of individuals in the population we're looking at, those we know and those we don't know. And the people that, you know, we've had in our system, if you will, or have dealt with in the past, rarely do we find a candidate, a final candidate, but we start our network in that respect. And then the people we don't know is what another way, you know, we refer to our primary research, which is all case dependent. I mean, it all depends on what the business is, what the need is, what the opportunity, what parameters we in the search committee or board put around the likely source of candidates that are going to be right for this, and then we go out and identify and approach individuals that are in the right positions within those companies. Put them all together. So, you know, typically when we get down to the selection, we've identified or maybe not spoken to all of them, but ordinarily somewhere over 100, 150 people.
Matt, when you're working with a board that's doing the search or looking at compensation to be competitive, what are some of the key elements that you look for when trying to bring on a new CEO in terms of benchmarking against other companies, et cetera?
So I think at the CEO level, it may be less challenging actually than maybe some of the lower hires. When we think about small organizations recruiting talent, you are often recruiting from a large organization that probably has more of an ability to pay at a higher level of cash, as well as provide equity that might be perceived as being more valuable. And so it's communicating the opportunity, communicating that the options do have value, not just the small benefits we were talking about, but that there is real upside. And then I think early on, thinking about how compensation is going to evolve over time. If you bring in a new head of sales who's now taking a discount, you have to think about what it's going to be like to hire the direct reports to that head of sales. And are they going to be willing to take that same discount? Are they going to have the same upside in the equity? Because if they're not, you're going to end up with a tangled mess where people are reporting to people who ultimately aren't making as much cash as they are. It happens over time, it happens quickly when companies aren't prepared, thinking about compensation growing from 10 employees to 40 to 200.
Thanks. Larry, as you're meeting with clients and they're looking at setting up compensation and equity plans, what do you see as some of the best practices in equity? Are we looking at trying to structure equity as much as possible as long-term capital gain, or what do you see?
Well, hating to sound like a CPA, it depends. But
that's the lawyer's answer, but can't steal from us.
The answer to the question is it truly is, it varies. It varies from stock options to restricted stock units to depending on the nature and how the company is set up, and there might actually be phantom stock agreements or share appreciation rights agreements, which are giving people a percentage of a potential future benefit without the need to actually have to give up some of the control of the company. But it hasn't changed over the years. I mean, sometimes the option pools are a little bit, sometimes they're a little bit more than they may have been in the past, but for the most part, it's as others have said, there's not a lot of cash in the business, so we're gonna leverage the growth and hope that the people who are involved are gonna wanna participate in that growth.
So, Angelo, you had raised the point earlier that, you want somebody who doesn't necessarily want to be in the big, huge business if they're going to an early stage business.
Mhm.
How do you attract them with equity without giving away too much of the store until you know they're a proven quantity? Are you?
Well, everybody has to vest in the equity,
Right.
right? And so normally, for startups at least, the vesting agreements, they're all different types, but the more common ones now are 4 years of vesting with the first year being a cliff. So if you don't make it through the first 12 months, you don't get any equity. The starting point for all this though, when I'm working with companies, the starting point is in building the pro forma. You do this forward thinking of, okay, well, let's start with actually a product plan. What are we going to build? And when are we going to build it? And then feather the head count into that and look at when do we need to hire different types of people, realizing that, you'll often see, we're going to hire 8 engineers in May. And I'll say, well, there are 3 of you here. How many interviews are you going to do? How many times are you going to interview the final candidates? All right, so you're not going to do anything but interview. You're not going to do any coding or anything, right, in April, because all you're going to be. So we have to think through all of that and then do your pro forma. And then part of that is an equity, what we call an equity balance sheet or an equity cap table. Who are the hires that were coming in? What are the flavors? What are the range of equity we're going to give them? What is the range of salary we're going to give them? So we avoid this issue that Matt talked about, which is, you end up with people in weird ranges. And then you also have to realize that that is going to change as the company gets de-risked. The amount of equity you're giving away is going to diminish, because someone coming in year 2 or 3 of the company does not deserve the same amount of equity that somebody who took all the risks that came in year 1. So it sounds very complex, but it's actually just blocking and tackling that unfortunately a lot of companies have gotten away from. And I think that's how you end up with a tangled vest sometimes.
May I add just one other thing to add on to Angelo's comments, which are right on. Oftentimes we use the vesting schedule as a way to kind of insulate the risk around an employee not working out. We've also, in some of the startups I've worked with, used a milestone grant approach, right? Which is to say, look, okay, great new whiz-bang VP of tech, we want you to have 4% of the company. But the way we're going to do that is we're going to give you 1% the day you walk in the door, and on a certain set of milestones, all targeted at us trying to get our money, we're going to give you other tranches of that. And so that you use the vesting schedule, but you can also use kind of a milestone gifting that can add kind of insulation around your downside risk if that's in fact what you're concerned about. And oftentimes, you have the vesting schedule which protects your downside, because if they don't stay very long, you don't have to worry about giving them stock. But what that doesn't protect against is somebody who is not terrible enough to fire them, but not actually driving as hard as they can to try to help you get your next financing goal,
right,
or whatever your next goal is. And that's really, feathering milestones into that whole grant structure kind of helps you kind of keep the, shoulder to the wheel to make sure everybody is really driving at, getting whatever that next event is.
Right, and with milestone financing, there's a challenge as well in that you might hire a VP of sales and she's fabulous, but the development team is 9 months late in developing the product. And how do you keep her incentivized to stay?
I was actually going to comment on that. The one challenge with milestones is you really have to think very carefully about what some of the intended consequences are and the unintended consequences. And you can't have, if we're just talking about vice president types, you can't have them working at cross purposes with one another, and you can't have them sort of pointing the finger of, well, I should still get my bonus because we developed the product but she couldn't sell it, or she says, the product was too late and that's why I couldn't hit my numbers. So these things have to be, you have to be able to fit them together, fit the milestones together, and understand how is someone going to behave in this. There was an old professor, I don't know if you had him, I forget his name now, but he used to talk about REM, Rational Evaluative Maximizing Man. And he said that every time you design one of these compensation schemes, you have to be thinking about people who are rational, evaluative, and maximizing. And what that means is that everybody acts in their own self-interest first, and the greater good of the group second. And it's a horrible way to think about things, but unfortunately people behave that way. So when you design these schemes, you have to be thinking about that. You know, are they going to optimize around themselves or around the greater good?
So Jim, somebody's trying to bring in a C-level executive to a company that's, you know, beyond startup, has some significant funding, but still relatively early stage. What do you find those executives are looking for in terms of equity and balance between equity and cash and bonus compensation?
Well, and those are typically the companies that we will work with. For lack of a better term, just call them emerging growth category, somewhere kind of post-Series B up to mid-market companies. And the packages can depend a lot on the circumstances of the business, but by and large, you know, we're seeing the pendulums begin to swing, or it has swung back toward the equity upside. You know, I mean, I think in the few years following 2008, everybody wanted to run to cash. You know, they wanted to trade off those options and not be willing to forego some of the base cash compensation for the equity. And I think that's definitely back now. You know, we're finding much more focus on the upside that they can gain through equity within the business.
And Matt, as you're working with compensation committees and benchmarking, and understanding that every industry is different, for earlier stage companies, where do I find the comparables? What do I benchmark against?
I think this is where you do have to rely on your search partner and your other advisors. I mean, unfortunately, data's not so publicly available, and so it's going to come down to what sort of survey sources you can find and what you hear through word of mouth, what the candidate is telling you, and you just have to balance these different variables and come up with what you think is affordable for you, but also would provide enough incentive for the individual.
Okay.
You know,
Yes, Larry.
I've been listening to all this, and I don't mean to bring this conversation down into the weeds a little bit, but one of the things that we historically find is that as these compensation packages are beginning to be thought of or have been implemented, and then we get the phone call, is the tax implications of a lot of these things. And the biggest concern that we have, and we strongly believe that the tax laws don't wag the dog. I mean, you don't run your company in order to minimize taxes, because if you do, you'll run it into the ground. But the fact of the matter is that I can't tell you how many times we get calls more after the fact than before the fact, saying, okay, well, we've just given X individual 100,000 shares of stock. And we go, great. Do they understand that based on what you just did, that they may have a tax? They may have a tax that they're going to have to pay, because if your company has any kind of value, you've just given something of value to somebody to compensate them. And you know, all the different compensation arrangements have their own tax strategies that are involved in, be them qualified options or phantom stock agreements or restricted stock units. And it is incredibly important that as you're thinking through your compensation scheme, that you find somebody who understands what the tax implications of that are. I know that's a pretty self-serving comment to be making, but the fact of the matter is that question is, I learned from you, that question needs to be asked, because it gets very expensive, and people's expectations of what they may be putting in their pocket at a later point could be severely compromised.
Yeah, one area where we see that quite often is with stock options, where people who are not in this field, who, you know, maybe an engineer or a great salesperson, but they don't live and breathe by the tax code, get a stock option, exercise it the day before the sale, get stuck with ordinary income, or find out that even if they want to exercise before the sale, they have to worry about alternative minimum tax. And there are all these hidden traps with stock options. I think I saw a study that said something like 97% of people do not exercise and hold their stock options for the required period of time to get a capital gain. So they end up paying all straight ordinary income tax, and the healthcare surplus fees apply to that as well?
Maybe. I mean, again, it depends on the type of entity that's being sold. But the fact is that qualified stock options, everybody sits there and goes stock options and says long-term capital gain.
Right.
Because everybody thinks that, all right? For the most part, historically, qualified stock options, it's just another ordinary income incentive compensation, where you pay a certain amount, you therefore minimize at least some part of your tax. But I can't tell you how many times, I can probably count on two hands the number of times I've seen somebody do a qualifying disposition of their qualified stock options to be able to get capital gains at some point. Most people who are getting qualified stock options, they're not going to do anything with them. They're not going to exercise them until the day of the liquidity event. And if that's when you do that, you might as well have gotten a bonus, because really all it is compensation. I don't minimize the good thing that a qualified stock option is as far as an incentive compensation, but you really have to reduce down the expectation of capital gain if you're looking to, as you're looking at those. And I think that's just something that you tell the people who are coming in. I mean, you're not doing tax planning for those people, but you really need to let them know that we're doing this, we think that it's important, you're going to get 60% of whatever you ultimately sell your stock options for, and just be aware that when I'm talking to you about my 20% capital gain, it's not going to be that for you. But we believe in you, we want to either give you stock or we want to give you the right to be able to invest, and it's just another part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. What do you do with you're looking to hire a C-level executive and he or she has, 3 kids in college and they're looking to maximize their cash payments and your company is cash strapped? Has anybody seen any innovative approaches there other than going out and raising more capital for the company or trying to leverage? Because a lot of times we'll see there's that mismatch where the company is too early stage to pay the market salary. And Angelo, you mentioned you work for 40% of what you would get at a large company. Are there any other tools, or is it just more equity, or some way of trying to? I've seen ways of people trying to provide some liquidity in the equity with a put option down the road, so people can sell some shares. Or is it just a mismatch and you got to go look for the next person?
I hate to say it,
Yeah.
I think there's probably a mismatch in what you describe. I mean, I haven't seen any structure that could work. I mean, short of there being some participation in an event, meaning, and I don't mean a financing event, I mean, we get a big contract in, there's some way that the company can get liquidity out of an event and then share it with the employee. But short of that, I don't know that I've seen anything that can answer that, unfortunately.
No, I think the hard part is that, talking to people recently who said, that they were advocating for the older executive with a family because of the just sort of the wisdom of years and the pressure to pay bills, and that's a good thing to have. I don't know. I think that it's the individual's choice, but you don't want somebody who, you want someone who is aware of the risks that they're taking. And when you're doing a startup, there's lots of risks. The majority of them fail. And they have to be confident enough that they're either going to be able to build a business or bounce back and land on their feet if it doesn't work out. What you don't want is someone who gets into the job and comes to you 3 months later and says, geez, I really need more money, because it's not there to have. And then I think one of the biggest mistakes that companies make is, hiring that high 6-figure individual. And it's a total misfit for the company, mismatch. Now you've got a lot of compensation going out the door. It's a lot of cash you're burning, and you're not getting what you need because that person doesn't really understand what it's like to work in a startup environment.
What about, maybe Matt, you could answer this in terms of the person who says, I don't have as large enough of equity stake as I should have. I've been here 3 years. I'm doing great. The company's doing great. But I look around and my friends at companies X, Y, and Z, and they have 3 times the equity percentage that I have. How does a company address that?
So I think the thing with equity is that the later the later the stage you are in, the more voices there are who are trying to keep dilution levels down, and it's harder to be more generous with the equity. We've seen it with CEOs and co-founders who are in that exact same position, and they're saying, I was here early, I had a great steak, and now I own 1/20th of what I used to own. And it's a challenge, and it's a conversation, and I think that it has to be framed correctly. There's a right time to talk about it. We have a client who was in the process of looking at equity across the entire organization, but focusing on the executives, ended up hitting a bump in the road with the business, and they said, you know what, this isn't the right time to raise this with the board. It would seem entirely self-serving. Let's address this down the road. So I think it's just a function of weighing the situation, finding the right time, and approaching it right, because as there are more and more shareholders, you have to be conscientious of everybody's perspective, and it's a much harder argument to sell at that point.
Does the argument that, well, yes, you've got a smaller sliver, but it's a much bigger pie, how effective is that when you're actually talking to people, or is it just, they say, no, I don't buy it?
So actually, I think this ties into the last question. I was thinking about not just attracting somebody who has a need for cash, but then incenting somebody who maybe didn't have that need for cash, but now 5 or 6 years later is trying to buy a house, has their kids in daycare and whatnot, and so you need to be creative. You need to convey the value. You need to find a way to keep people motivated, and there are different ways to motivate people. I think even beyond just the dollar numbers or that sliver of the pie. Even if you have a smaller sliver of a larger pie, if it's not liquid, it doesn't help you buy that house. It doesn't help you pay for your kids' childcare. And so I think paper numbers aren't necessarily all that they're made out to be when you're living your own personal situation. So it's a very delicate balance.
Linda and Angelo, as you're involved with many early stage companies, who sets the compensation policy? Is it the CEO in terms of hiring and attracting people, or are you asking to get involved as an investor in helping to make those decisions?
Well, it depends on how the company is structured. I mean, if the company has taken venture capital or angel capital, then normally there's a compensation committee that gets put together. CEOs are usually on that committee, except when it comes to discussing their compensation. So that's kind of the way. Otherwise, it is sort of the founder that does that, and hopefully they're getting some guidance from advisors and others.
The compensation strategy, it's relatively straightforward in I agree it's in the structures that Angelo describes, but the compensation strategy is put in place to, align and amplify the company strategy. That's all it is. And it's what tools can you bring to bear to actually accelerate the company's realizing its goals. That's all it does. And it's the people, it's a conversation, and the relevant people to add into that conversation can very often be the CEO, it can be members of the board, it can be advisors, who have lots of skills. A long time ago, Neil sat on my board and, brought a lot of value into that conversation. So there's all sorts of people that can be in that conversation, but the compensation strategy itself is very straightforward. It is simply what tools can you put in place to accelerate or amplify the goals of the company, that the company realizes what it's on the field to do.
Yeah,
That's it.
As
That's all it
Larry
is.
said, it hasn't changed very much. It's the same set of tools. I think the biggest change that I've seen in recent times is because we don't have, we've had a pretty anemic IPO situation. And we had the development of second market, which allowed individuals to sell their shares, their vested shares on the second market. That has sort of made things a little more challenging, and I think a little more difficult. There was a recent, I can't remember the company, but there was a recent situation where, you know, a founder cashed out at $30 million, young 20-something, and then the company failed. And there's no clawback or anything for that. So that's one of the more recent phenomenon that I've seen. I don't know if you've seen that in any of your companies where it's been a challenge.
Jim, how often are the people that you're attracting to new companies, how often are they leaving their old companies because they're dissatisfied with compensation as compared to, you know, looking for a new strategic challenge? Is compensation a big issue for them?
It definitely, yeah, it definitely is, particularly, you know, now that the economy's, you know, has gained steam and is things, you know, the perception is that everything is much better, more solid, more stable, I guess I would say. I don't like, you know, probably shouldn't use the word secure, but, you know, people are looking around saying, gee, I could be doing much better if I had a company that has more legs, that, you know, is growing more rapidly, more aggressively. So yes, they, like I said, commented earlier that I think the mindset has shifted back towards looking for a longer-term upside, and as a
With
result,
the understanding that if it doesn't work out, there's probably, because the market is more secure, there'll be other opportunities available. There's a lack of talent, and
correct,
it's more of a buyer, excuse me, well, more of a seller's market there. Yeah.
right.
Okay. Interesting. So we talked about, you know, the fact, and Angelo raised a great point, that most companies are not going public, and it was just an article in Venture Outlook on that. The numbers were staggering in terms of people not looking for IPO exits but being sold. And with a lot of strategic buyers as well as private equity, that market's still very strong. What do you do with the person who you brought in and 2 years into a 4-year vesting schedule, the company gets sold? Do you accelerate in full? What are some of the tools that people use to not unduly reward those folks, but not to harm them either? What do people say? Do you see full vesting on a change of control? Do you have to stay? Do you have to, is there a double trigger? Jim?
I see it a lot, and one of the more frequently, I don't want to say contentious, but it seems to always come up on the executive side for a CEO, you know, especially for a CEO. They want full vesting in the event of change of control, and it's usually negotiated at some point between not having it at all and having 100% vesting. In other words, maybe there's milestones, time frames that are put into the final employment agreement that says, you know, the acceleration will take place over time. The amount of acceleration will trigger over time, depending on how long the executive's been with the organization. Had one not too long ago that was when the selection was made and the candidate joined the company, there was a potential deal on the table, and he wanted, you know, so they put a tranche of vesting centered around that potential transaction happening, and put my kind of like what Linda was talking about early on about milestone vesting in place. So no, I don't remember the original question.
So we definitely do see that. I think that the one distinction is that sometimes it would be more common for some of the functional roles, head of HR, CFO, people who might be less likely to be retained after the sale. So to the extent companies are varying practices amongst individuals, it would be the more technical people who might not have that same benefit. But it is certainly a hot topic, and I mean it is a big benefit and something that could be negotiated beyond just how much cash are you going to give me and how big is my piece of the pie. I think individuals realize the value of having that acceleration upon a liquidity event.
Larry?
This is more of a general 30,000-foot answer, but you know, sometimes I find myself going back to Stephen Covey, and I got as far as 6 and couldn't get beyond the 7th one. So I don't know what that one was, but it may have been be patient. But one of the things that he was very strong in, and I totally believe in this space, is begin with the end in mind. And I think that your question is another planning point that people should have as they're putting their businesses together, because in this day and age, in this space, your business was created ultimately to be sold. Now, people all love their babies and they don't want to be throwing them out. But at the end of the day, it's going to be an IPO. Chances are not. It's going to be a liquidity event. It's going to be some kind of a strategic partnership. You need to keep in mind what the exit strategies could be in addressing the question that you raise, so that in fact you minimize the amount of aggravation, if you will, at the point of some kind of an exit strategy. And I mean, it's easier said than done, but I think for the audience here and for others who who are involved with this space, that's a very important part of the process.
One of the bigger challenges that you have is there's what gets negotiated when the recruiter and you're bringing the person on board, and then there's what gets negotiated when that M&A transaction is occurring, because the companies buy people and they'll have key individuals that they want to protect, and if they know that those people all have full acceleration, that's a problem, because what they don't want to do is have them jumping ship immediately upon the acquisition closing or in the near term. There's usually things they want to get done. So there's two elements to that. One is that some of that stuff might get renegotiated. Even though you might have full acceleration, that might be something that holds up the deal, and they say, well, we're not going to do this, so we got to go back and renegotiate that. I think that's what you're referring to. And then the other is, if you're unable to do that, then what incentives can be put on the table by the acquiring company that would keep those individuals in place for some period of time, so that you're getting the value that, you're getting something out of the premium you just paid for this business.
Right. And the classic example is, when Genentech was sold in California, I don't know how many years ago now, they created something like 250 millionaires, and California has no non-competes. So they created this whole class of people who had a lot of cash in their pockets, could go out and start their own companies, and they all left. And they actually started a club called Genentech for former Genentech, senior people. And so we see a lot of companies now from the buy side building in retained bonuses. If you stay for 2 years, you get X. Interestingly, we had a client that in the software space that got acquired by a big, huge corporation. I said to myself, these people are never going to stay. And it's now been 4 years and they're all still there. And I was talking to them. And I said, how come you're still there? And they said, you know what? They let me do what I want to do. It's really interesting work. And that gets back to maybe that, software. And I know that I've made some money selling my business. I could go out and start another one. But this is also, they're respecting me and giving me really interesting work. Linda, you must have run into that a lot when Iron Mountain was in its acquisition.
We had more than 200 acquisitions that we tried to feather into this big company, and I would say that I'll feather in my Golden Seeds experience as well. Relatively few. When you look across all the acquisitions, the amount of people on executive teams where we were acquiring, the amount of people who had full acceleration on change of control were relatively few. Right? It's not blanketed throughout teams, at least not in our experience. The second thing I will say is what Angelo and others have alluded to, which is at the point when you're conceiving the deal, that's the point where a seller can negotiate pretty strongly on behalf of his or her team, right? And she can say, look, these are the 6 people who are critical to this business, and you need to incent them strongly. And that at that moment, before any negotiated deal is penned, that's the point where the leverage happens. And a lot of cash can be kind of drummed up at that moment to try to incent those key players. And it happens very frequently, at least in my experience.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think one last question, then we'll go to your questions, which is, we talked about advisors, boards of directors, boards of managers for LLCs. Is their compensation almost entirely equity-based from your experience? Or are you paying outside directors cash fees for earlier stage companies?
I haven't seen cash fees, other than if you have someone that's coming in, flying in, you pay their expenses, but normally it's equity-based compensation.
Okay, great. Well, let's open it up to your questions. Yes.
I have sort of a program question. I'm a part-time CFO and I have a couple clients, and one of the clients is a family-run business. And they're at this point where the children aren't ready to take it, the owner is getting older, and they need to do a transition, they want to bring in some professional management. So they turn to me, how do I set up a compensation structure? We don't really want to give them equity, but we want someone to participate in value creation. And I'm sitting there saying, well, do I call my accountant? Do I call my lawyer? Do I find a compensation consultant? Where do I start? And you know, of course, it's small. It's a family-run business. It's not that small. It's like $10 million. But the you know, they don't have an infinite budget. So I'm sort of wondering how to approach that problem.
The answer to your question is yes.
Yes.
You basically talk to all of us. I mean, you know, the first place you go is the accountant and the attorney, because what you're talking about is, you're talking about share appreciation rights agreements or something. If they're an LLC, you can do profits interest so that people are getting future benefits and aren't having to pay for it. Family-run businesses are tough if you got to kind of pay attention to whether or not the kids are actually going to take it over, let alone going to be able to. Family-owned businesses, they don't survive real. They're a little bit better survival rate than venture deals, but in the second and third generation. But the fact is,
I think that's one of the reasons why they want to move to professional team.
But if you don't want to give up the control, the actual stock control, the legal control, then things like share appreciation rights, phantom stock agreements. Now these are all compensation deals. None of them are going to generate capital gain, but it gives you the opportunity to be able to incentivize somebody that there's at least some part of a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow.
Right. Also, for the company that's not looking for the liquidity event, that is a service business that's producing significant cash and income. I've seen situations where employees said, "Hey, I had this option. It's been vested for 5 years. What do I do with it?" By exercise, I got to pay a huge amount of taxes up front because the value of the company is so high. So it gets back to, I think, Angelo's early, what's the equity map of what you're going to be doing and thinking long term. So it's not just family businesses as well. Yes, Jerry.
So a lot of the discussion has been around executive compensation structures, but I'm wondering about hiring the rank and file, the engineers, the sales and marketing people. If I'm a small startup, I'm not using a search firm, I'm just networking, how do I get a sense of what the market rates are, what sort of packages of cash, equity are appropriate? How about hiring the rank and file people?
Matt, you want to talk?
There are survey databases that do provide that level of detail. I think oftentimes venture companies have a level of knowledge. I think some of them actually maintain their own databases when they're working within a very specific industry. There is data. It's survey data, but you can talk to a compensation consultant, a venture firm. There are even some publicly available sources as well that you can get that data.
One other place that you may look is a fair number of universities do surveys among their alumni. Harvard Business School does it, MIT does it, MIT Sloan School does it. Lots of schools poll their alumni ranks and ask them, where their comp is, what the average salary is, and they do that by different cuts. And so, if you have a junior level person that can kind of snoop around, you can kind of get a lot of information, through the university systems as well, which can help. And then industry associations do that same thing very often. When it's kind of a no money down, we need access to data, I would say those two sources are ones that are pretty fertile, at least for the early stage people that we work with.
What about like a salary.com website, or is that?
All the surveys are fine. The thing you have to realize with surveys is that they've taken time to come together. And if you're in a fluid market where, a couple of years ago, if you were trying to hire engineers that were experts in Ruby, it was really, really difficult, and it changed the compensation scheme. If you can find a really good one that you wanted to pull out of a company, you had to pay up for that individual. So again, I think it starts with putting together that equity budget and the salary budget of what are the ranges that you're going to pay for, let's just say, engineering or coders, right? I like to keep it simple, so I put the coders into 3 different buckets, right, of experience, and then say this is what we pay. Then go out and test that with, talk to your friends, talk to your advisors, talk to the people that are sitting on boards, angels, venture capitalists. Even if you're starting and you're not raising venture or angel money, you should be talking to them anyway because you may in the future, and you want to get on their radar screen, and they'll share that information with you.
Great, great.
And it's market-based.
Yes.
Yeah, so going back to stock options, and probably a question for Angelo and Linda, and anybody else that may want to comment. It seems like there's still a lot of early stage companies that will provide all employees stock options. And to a comment earlier about the value, some employees don't seem to value the stock options so much, and I would agree, certainly, let's say for the lower level people that don't all understand them so well and probably don't put much value on them. So in addition to these companies having the kegerator in the kitchen down the hall, which is a different topic, but they're giving stock options to all employees. So do you still see that as the common practice? Do you think it really makes sense given kind of what sometimes seems to be a lack of appreciation for the potential value of those at some level?
Absolutely, at least in our experience, absolutely. I mean, even though that there's a need for continual education, particularly around the role of valuation and how that changes as the company matures. What most employees at whatever level understand is, the worth of a share. And the challenge of education that the company needs to do is how that share feathers into value and how that value changes over time as achievements happen within the company. And that, that has to be part of the talk track, right? The CEO has to have that stuff going on all the time. Otherwise, it derails and people say, oh, well, I used to have, 2% of the company, but now I only have 100,000 shares because we have, a bazillion shares now. And you lose the value, right? If you don't keep the talk track, if it bifurcates away from being linked to value, then you lose it and you don't get it back.
I once had to explain a reverse stock split to a room of engineers, and that was an adventure. I actually think you're absolutely right. It's a constant education, and here's the one challenge with it: a little bit of knowledge is a very dangerous thing. Especially, I always found, not to disparage engineers, but I will. When you're dealing with the engineers, they get a little bit, and they've got it all figured out, and It amazes me, maybe this is something we should sit down and write with a good accountant and a good lawyer, is something called Life of the Pie, not Life of Pi, but Life of the Pie. And explain to people how, yes, you owned 100%, but you had a 12-inch pizza. And the whole idea here is that you're going to own slices, and the slice is going to get thin, but the size of the pie is going to get huge, hopefully. And that's why you do this. And then explain things to people like 83B or restricted shares and the tax consequences to that, or quals and non-quals, and just put a small pamphlet together and then educating the employees on this. I just feel that when people don't value the stock, it's because they don't, one of two reasons: they either don't believe in it or they just don't understand it and they're afraid to ask. So I think that kind of education has to be constantly done.
It's funny, you talk about, you hate to hear that people have been in business for 30 years because you think that that's been a long time. For those of us who have been in business for 45 years, you guys are just starting. But the fact is that it's the comment that Angelo just made. When I first stepped into the MIT Enterprise Forum and started to get involved in this community, that was one of the most important things that people were trying to explain to entrepreneurs who sat there and watched their 100% valuation go down to 5%, and explaining to them that that was the way things were going to be if you were going to create some kind of this venture deal. It's kind of refreshing to know that as things change, they stay the same.
Right. One other thing I would add is that I find there's tremendous variability in structure of compensation programs depending on the type of company. So for example, if you have a traditional manufacturing company that's where the labor may not be particularly highly skilled, you won't see stock options and people probably won't value them. But in a software startup, everyone has them from, if it's a person on the loading dock, but somebody who's not critical to the operations of the company, everyone has them. They make a big point of giving everyone a certificate that looks like a stock certificate, but it's a certificate to have a stock option or profits interest or whatever. And it's treated like gold. It's the perception people have is that it is gold. We have time for one last question. Yes?
Oh, don't want to end it on a bad note, but any strategies for dealing with the down round and communicating that to the staff? Just, oh, my stock is not worth what it was, and morale
Yeah.
issues. and
How
things
come
like
my
that.
option's at $12 a share and they just sold stock at 50 cents a share? And that's preferred stock and I have common stock. What am I going to do with this, right? Down rounds. You put on a suit of armor and explain it to the staff?
You know, I think that, it has to be communicated as part of a larger message, right? And that message has to be about, yes, we took a down round, and that means we have access to capital, which is going to let us do X and Y and Z. And we need all of you to help us do those three things, because if we do, then your stock or the valuation of the company will be X, and your participation will be that much more. So if it is just woe is me, we have a down round, this is misery, then I assure you, within 90 days you'll have your best people out the door.
Yeah.
But if you can articulate it as part of what it allows you to do and the confidence you have in the team and what that team then needs to do with you to make that happen, it's part of what happened. I mean, that many companies do it, and so it's really a communications challenge more than anything else.
Larry, are you saying repricing of options on down rounds or generally, or?
Not a lot, I mean, only because it just wreaks havoc from a standpoint of a reporting issue, from a reporting issue. I mean, yeah, it happens, but, I think, what's been said before is it's all part of communication. And this is the space you're in, and these are the risks that you run, and you need to be able to express that and just make people aware. I mean, you don't want to sit there and say to people, okay, your $12 option may go to 50 cents, but I think it's a matter of keeping people informed who are stakeholders in the business as to how the business is going, up or down, to be able to mitigate some of the negativity that may occur from that.
The context is important as well. I mean, it is more challenging if you are one of the few companies taking a down round when everyone else is doing up rounds. Endeca took a down round in 2001 and went on to be a tremendous success for everyone involved. And it is about, by the way, that communication, from my perspective, I don't know if you would agree with this, but I think that's what separates the good from the great CEOs. It's the ability, everybody can communicate in good times. Everybody wants to go talk to the press, be on a panel, right? It's when the fit hits the shan, how do you behave? And are you able to keep everybody in the boat rowing, or does the company come apart? Because the best people lead first, and that's the challenge.
Okay, great. Well, I notice it's a little past 9 o'clock. I promised people we'd get you out at 9. So I'd like to thank our panel very much. Great discussion, folks. Thank you all so much for attending. Happy holidays. We're already at that season. And we'll be back with our next program after the snow stops, which will probably be, June or July, but more likely March. So thanks again. Have a great day, everyone.